Hello, I'm John Brisson, author of Fix Your Gut and Health Coach. Welcome to the Fix Your Gut YouTube channel. Today we are going to talk about the neurotransmitter dopamine. Now, most of the time when you think about happiness and you think about the neurotransmitter serotonin, which a lot of people are prescribed SSRIs, which increase the amount of serotonin that's within the brain to help with depression. But actually, serotonin is more associated with mood stabilization and wakefulness or alertness. So it's kind of like those peaks and valleys that happen with people with bipolar disorder, where they go from being manic, which is having a lot of energy and a lot of motivation, to being depressed. Serotonin kind of helps limit those peaks and valleys of mood fluctuation, where dopamine is actually associated with alertness too, like serotonin, but it's actually more associated with being happy and being motivated. I mean, when we get up in the morning and we're exposed to blue light from the sun, and it starts producing dopamine. That helps us start getting up for the day, getting alert, and helps us go to work and get things checked off our to-do list. And there's a feedback mechanism with dopamine too as well. We'll talk about that later. So what is dopamine exactly? Dopamine is organic catechol from the catecholamine family, and it's produced and needed by our body for different critical functions. Okay, so the neurotransmitter is produced both from the amino acids L-tyrosine and L-phenylalanine that we get from protein ingestion. Okay, so what happens is the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase converts either L-tyrosine or L-phenylalanine into L-dopa. Using oxygen, iron, and BH4 as the cofactors needed for that conversion. And then from L-dopa, B6 is required, which is prodoxyl phosphate, to both produce L-dopa and to help with the conversion of L-dopa into later dopamine. So the pathway you have is either L-phenylalanine or L-tyrosine, which you have to convert L-phenylalanine into L-tyrosine, and then L-tyrosine to L-dopa, and then L-dopa to actual dopamine. And the body is not the only thing that produces dopamine. Our body isn't the only producer of dopamine within us. Bacteria can too, especially from the Escherichia and the Bacillus genus. Those bacteria are able to produce dopamine within our digestive tract and within our body. So yeah, it's what happens is when we produce catecholamines like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, there's kind of like a rate limit action to that, where the more we produce, tyrosine hydroxylase actually becomes inhibited within the cytosol of the cell, and then it reduces the production of dopamine. And then once the production of dopamine is lowered and we eventually need more, tyrosine hydroxylase actually starts being produced again. There's kind of like a rate limit to that in its production too that I want to talk about. So plants do produce dopamine, and many foods that we consume have dopamine in it. But the reason why you don't get a boost of dopamine from eating foods is because dopamine is not, for one, it can't cross the blood-brain barrier, and two, when we ingest it, it goes into our bloodstream, and then it gets filtered out by our kidneys and excreted. So you can't increase dopamine through ingestion. It's just impossible. Now, L-dopa is able to cross the blood-brain barrier, but dopamine itself is not. So that's why they use the medication L-dopa for Parkinson's disease, and we'll talk about Parkinson's disease later. But yes, I mean, dopamine is also the precursor as well, for one thing, is for the other catecholamines known as norepinephrine and epinephrine, which epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. So you need a production of dopamine to produce both of those catecholamines as well. And they are broken down, the catecholamines are broken down by an enzyme known as cation-O-methyltransferase. And we'll talk more about COMT later. As well as aldehyde dehydrogenase, and they're eliminated by the kidneys in the urine after the catecholamines are broken down. Now, when dopamine is synthesized and metabolized, it's mainly happens within the cytosol of the cell, but it's extremely susceptible to oxidation, especially in presence of free iron within the cells. That's why most of your iron is bounded up by iron transporter proteins unless needed by the body for cellular respiration, like ferritin and transferritin. But when iron is not bounded up, and a person has a lot of free iron, it can start causing dopamine to become oxidized, which has to be inhibited cellularly by glutathione. And if it's not, it starts creating massive mitochondrial oxidative stress and starts forming these dopamine quinones, which are very reactive and can really cause damage to the mitochondria and have to be neutralized by glutathione and superoxidized dimutase, because they are, they can cause a lot of issues as dopamine quinones as radicals to the mitochondria, causing poor health. So yes, dopamine has to be tightly regulated by the body, and has to iron has to be regulated by the body too, to prevent these dopamine quinones to form, which can be very damaging to cells. And Dr. Ben Lynch wrote a lot about it when he discussed catechol methyltransferase in his book Dirty Genes. So what does dopamine do for our health? I mean, dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter associated with pleasure. It's what makes us feel happy. It's what makes us feel motivated. And there's a reward pathway to that. I mean, there's a motivational pathway for dopamine being produced by the body for that. We are rewarded when we get our primary needs met, whether it's eating, drinking water, or we're doing social needs too, like healthy sexual contact, or positive parental care, taking care of our offspring, lactation. All of those help properly modulate the dopamine cycle, okay, which is, we do a positive reward, more dopamine is produced and released into the body. We feel good about what we have accomplished. Then the dopamine reduces itself as the body eliminates it through using catechol methyltransferase and aldehyde dehydrogenase through the kidneys, and then we go back to feeling normal. Because if not, we would feel happy all the time and we'd feel high, similar to doing drugs that increase dopamine, like opioids and cocaine and stuff like that. You would be able to function. Eventually, it could lead to mania and anxiety when you have too much dopamine. Most schizophrenics have differing amounts of dopamine within their brain and can have too much sometimes, which could trigger those symptoms too. But other than the reward pathway, and there are some negatives to the reward pathway, we'll get to that later. What does dopamine do? It inhibits norepinephrine relief, so it acts as a vasodilator. Norepinephrine constricts the blood vessels, helps regulate the motor control of our muscles. It's also essential for motor function and learning of new motor skills. That's why people with Parkinson's disease, they can't stop shaking because they can't control the motor control of the muscles very well. Reduces sodium excretion and urine output. It reduces the activity of lymphocytes within the immune system. Enhances the activity of cones within the retina during the daytime while suppressing rods, increasing sensitivity to color and contrast, so we can look at our beautiful world. Inhibits secretion of hormone prolactin by the pituitary gland. Dopamine triggers nausea and vomiting by activating the dopamine receptors in the chemical receptor trigger zone of the medulla oblongata, which is the reason why ginger, which blocks this release of dopamine, helps much with nausea. And the same with the drug Zofran. It inhibits serotonin and the dopamine that's associated with triggering what is known as a chemical receptor trigger zone, which is associated with nausea and vomiting. Dopamine is also released into the small intestine by the pancreas, and is released into the digestive tract also by dopamine producing cells, which improves the mucosal barrier. That's why people with low dopamine levels have been associated with having ulcers within their gastrointestinal tract and their stomach. And it also decreases intestinal motility. You don't want your motility to be too fast, because you would not be able to absorb nutrients and you would have diarrhea all the time. But you don't want it to be too slow either, because then you get constipated and it builds up with toxins and everything. So there's a regulation. Serotonin increases motility, dopamine decreases motility. So there's kind of like a balance going on within the body to control motility. And that's also why opioids, for example, decrease motility, because they increase dopamine. Of course, one of the main triggers for dopamine production in the morning is retinal blue light exposure, and it interacts with tyrosine. And so light exposure, circadian rhythm genes also regulate the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase to produce dopamine. So dopamine production is strongly regulated by our circadian rhythm and natural daylight time exposure. Increased artificial light exposure in our modern lives, especially at night, is creating excessive amounts of dopamine, and doing so dramatically increases dopamine oxidation. So yes, when you're staring at your phone at night, because dopamine is supposed to be lower at night because dopamine interacts with melatonin. So when you have more dopamine, you have less melatonin, and melatonin is, of course, important for sleep, and it's a very strong antioxidant. So when you're staring at your phone, it's got, 6,000 degree Kelvin full blue light in front of your face at 11 o'clock at night, and you're getting all those Facebook likes and those Instagram likes, your dopamine is through the roof. And that is not doing you any favors. It's increasing oxidative stress on the mitochondria by increased production of dopamine quinones, because dopamine is supposed to be lower at night. And as well as it's also causing an issue with melatonin production. That is definitely two whammies that are not good for your health at all. And there's also been some studies linking the natural light exposure to decreasing the risk of developing Parkinson's disease and depression. Seasonal affective disorder has been linked to a lack of natural light exposure during the fall and winter. Most people link it to a reduction of serotonin and depression. However, most studies have actually linked it to a reduction of dopamine production because of a lack of natural light. As well as Parkinson's disease seems to worsen biologically in the winter seasons too, as well, from lack of blue light exposure. So they seem to be correlated with one another. So if you have low production and utilization of dopamine, generally you have the following symptoms: increased appetite, weight gain, depression, anhedonia, which is kind of like a feeling of nothing matters, lack of motivation, lack of attention, cognitive problems, compromised memory, elevated prolactin levels, lower or absent libido, poor bone density and health, Parkinson's disease, more likely to develop gastrointestinal ulcerations, and diarrhea. Symptoms of elevated production and utilization of dopamine: overactive sympathetic nervous system, too much adrenaline, agitation, aggression, anxiety, paranoia, delusions, schizophrenia, increased or fast cognition, kind of like racing thoughts, increased energy, insomnia, heightened libido, reward pathway seeking addiction, which you can see that both in low and elevated dopamine, which is just addiction to things that can negatively impact your health. Increased impulsive behavior, nausea and vomiting, burning mouth syndrome, constipation, and increased mitochondrial oxidative stress. Now, that being said, there's different parts of the body that you can see this fluctuation of dopamine. For example, burning mouth syndrome would be an increased production within the mouth, maybe not necessarily throughout the whole body, but I did want to make note of that too as well. So what can you do to reclaim proper dopamine homeostasis? Well, the first thing is the hardest thing for a lot of people to do, and it's difficult. I mean, we all have our vices, and that's breaking the cycle of addiction. I know it's difficult. I've witnessed addiction destroy the lives of friends and family members, as I know many of you watching this video have, or maybe some of you fall into the cycle of addiction yourself. I've talked about it in my past. My father had an addiction to heroin that he would fall into the cycle of addiction with it throughout his life. My father was a good man, but again, he would. Later, he started doing heroin in the 70s, which gave him hepatitis C, which was later diagnosed in the early 90s. And later, when his liver was failing, he got hooked on OxyContin, and of course, they were getting it out and not really telling the problems with OxyContin at the time. Of it being very addicting, they were kind of saying that it was not as addictive as other opioids, and he started needing more and more, and then eventually learned you could shoot it up in the form of hillbilly heroin. And I don't really blame him now as an adult, because he was in a lot of pain with his liver failing. But that being said, I've had personal experiences with this cycle of addiction through family members, and it's very tough. I mean, whether it's an addiction to technology, pornography, sex, drug use, opioids, MDMA, cocaine, alcohol, amphetamines, nicotine, they all modify dopamine, and they all have their different effects on one's health. Of course, nicotine addiction, for most people, is not as costly to one's health as a heroin addiction over time. But heroin addiction, usually your lifespan is a lot shorter than if you smoke cigarettes, even though I'm not saying anyone should do both. But and gambling and also overeating. You know, all of these negatively affect your health in different degrees of severity, and they can cause this cycle of addiction of, you know, increased dopamine when you do said action and decreased dopamine afterwards, so then you want to go do it again and you get stuck. So if reward pathway seeking behavior is affecting your health or your family or community, please seek help. That's all I can say. I'm not looking down on anybody. It's tough. It really is. But if you want to better yourself and better your life, you have to do those things. And I'd actually add one more thing to that, which is blue light exposure, especially at night. You gotta start putting filters on your devices that reduce blue light, and start wearing blue light blocking glasses when you can, because that would increase dopamine too, which could become a cycle of addiction as well. Though minor compared to the effects of the other ones, like pornography can have a bad effect on marriages. And healthy sexual behavior can have definitely an issue with a person's personal health of getting sexually transmitted diseases or passing them on the others. So there's some of these that are less of an issue than others, but that's debatable and arguable. But yeah, they all are important that you want to break those cycles to better your health and better your relationships with the people around you and to be a better part of your community too. Another thing you can do to help reclaim proper dopamine homeostasis is increase natural light exposure when possible. When you first wake up in the morning, open up your blinds and your curtains, let the light in. If you work in an office, try to open up your curtains and your blinds and let the natural light in. Try to eat your lunch outside. You know, those are all important things that you can do. Take a walk when possible, you know, to help get natural light exposure. Blocking blue light at night, I mentioned that earlier, things that could be done for that. Test to see if you have a catch-all methyltransferase polymorphism. And there's more more stuff on that on my blog, or I go in deep detail. And Joe Cohen has an excellent article in Self-Hacked about COMT. If you're a warrior, read that to get more information. It would take me a very long time, and I'll do a separate video on COMT maybe one day. Healthy lifestyle changes you can do to help increase production or help proper homeostasis, like regular exercise, healthy, safe sex life, meditation, yoga, massage therapy, accomplishing goals and tasks, and listening to music that you enjoy. Ingesting a diet that supports healthy levels of dopamine. I recommend the Perfect Health Diet. The diet allows, you know, a good amount of protein ingestion, seafood for omega-3s, vegetables, olive oil, dark chocolate, bananas, green tea, turmeric, oregano, nuts, and avocados, all which have their effect in increasing dopamine. The diet is also very low in refined sugar and alcohol. One last thing I want to talk about when it comes to dopamine regulation is mercury exposure can interfere with the neurotransmitter by blocking the enzyme dopamine beta hydroxylase. So if you do have mercury amalgams, you do want to get them safely removed. I like the SMART protocol when it comes to that. Try to find a good biological dentist. And also, if you do test positive for being mercury burdened and you've had your amalgams removed, or if you don't have any amalgams, then I recommend following the Andrew Hall Cutler protocol to detox from mercury safely. That is everything on dopamine. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.